and recording. Right, so it's 5 local time, it's 4 British time, and hello all, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Ari Nordstrom, and I'm representing MarkupUK, the organizing committee here today. And today is Thursday, the 4th of June. It would have been the first day of the physical MarkupUK conference. But as you all know, that didn't happen. So we wanted to do something for the community anyway, and that something is a series of webinars, 8 of them this June, and this is the first of them. So what else to say? Well, you should all know that we are recording these webinars and we will make them available later on. We also saving the chat as it is and making that available later on. And for this very first session, we are going to start with XProc. As you all should know, it's the year of XProc. There's a new standard, the 3.0 coming along now. It's pretty much finished. The editing team, the editors are working hard away, finishing that spec. And there's already a beta version of an XProc processor, Morgana XProc, out for anyone to test and have fun with. But you should really start somewhere with XProc 3. It's brand new. And so we have with us presenting Eric Siegel, who is part of the XProc editors team. And he will be walking you through sort of an introductory XProc session for 2 of them, one today and the next one Monday. And I hope you've all registered for both. And so Eric, I've known him for about 10 years. He's been around, we met on conferences. He's an XML specialist and content engineer from the Netherlands, doing Exist consulting, XProc consulting, obviously. He's doing training, and we're really happy to have him here with us today. Eric, please.
Thank you, Ari, for this introduction. I will now share my screen with you because I would like, it's probably better that you see my presentation than my head. Well, again, welcome everybody to this webinar. It's also my very first webinar at all. So I'm a bit nervous, but well, let's see how it goes. What I'm going to do in the next half hour, 3/4 of an hour or so, is walk you through the very basics of XProc. We're going to see what XProc is, how it works, what ports are, how to connect ports, etc., etc. And as Ari said, the next one is on Monday, June the 8th, next Monday, in which I will tell you some more nice things about XProc. There is a GitHub repository with all the examples and the presentations I'm of my webinars about XProc. So I suggest that you now or later download it and use it to play around with XProc. Right. Well, Ari introduced me already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of words on this one. So there are my contact details are there if you need me for anything XProc related or anything else. So let's start with what is XProc. XProc is an XML-based programming language. It's XML-based like XSLT is XML-based, and it's for processing complex data. It's for processing documents, and in a way that is called pipelining, which means that you take your data, your documents, and you can push them through an extensible set of small, sharp tools. This is a term that Norman Walsh invented. There are tools for creating, transforming the XML and other types of documents to get actually to the end results. There is already a version 1 available, and there are 2 processor implementations to run your pipelines with. It's around for 10 years, and version 1 is really a version 1. Version 3.0 is much better, much nicer. It uses XPath 3, etc., etc. The specification is still under development. We're nearly there, but not yet. But I think you can consider it quite stable. There are just some little bits and pieces that need to be done. For the implementations, I'm not sure about the status of XML Calabash for XProc 3, but there is a Morgana implementation made by Akim Berndsen, who is joining the webinar also, I saw. And it's in beta, but it's actually quite stable. And I'm happy to say that even one of my customers has decided to use this for production purposes. So I think you can really rely on it already. All right, well, maybe you're thinking, why should I bother? I can do it already. I process documents and whatever. But pipelines and pipeline processing are quite ubiquitous all around us. Think about oil refineries that literally do things with pipelining. Think about CPU architecture, which also is pushing data and bits and bytes through pipelines. The automobile industry, which is actually also a pipeline, taking a car through small steps until it's finished. So actually pipelining is a design pattern. And of course, in IT, the most common one is the Unix command line, which we all know by, and actually there's even a character called the pipe character, in which you can use to take a standard output from one command into the standard input of the next command. It also turns out a very natural choice for document processing. Once you get used to XProc, it will feel very natural to you. And maybe you're thinking now, well, I can do this with XLT, or I have an end tasks to process my XML into the shape I want it, or maybe command files, which are also very common. Well, yes, that's true, but XProc beats the alternatives, I think. It's a natural way of expressing what you want, and it's also much faster because it's you don't need to write intermediate results back to disk and reread them into memory again. Everything stays in memory, which makes once the pipeline starts, the whole thing very fast. Now here are some important links, and the most important one is in the yellow circle, and that's actually the XProc specification. So I want to take a very quick look with you about what's actually there. Let's have a look whether that works. Yeah. If you go to that link, you'll come to this page. And what you'll see there is that we have the specification itself of the language, which brings you to this page. And actually that's yeah, of course, the details are there, but I don't think you will refer to it very often. What is much more interesting is are the steps, because the steps are the tools you can chain together to create your pipelines. And we will have a look at some of the steps while during this webinar as well. The other interesting link is, of course, the Morgana XProc processor, and that's where you can download it and install it. And for those who want to read more, there are some introductory articles on xml.com about XProc. All right, what if you want to run the XProc 3.0 examples, whether you wrote them yourself or those that are in the GitHub of this presentation yourself? Well, you have to download Morgana, and the link is there. And then unzip it and add a section jar, for instance, the free home edition jar, to the library subdirectory. It isn't included because of licensing reasons. And also make sure you have Java 8 and not another one, because otherwise it won't run. Then add it to your systems path, and then you can just type in Morgana and something should happen. And let me just do that. So let's check. So here's my command line, and I now type Morgana. And what you see is that Morgana presents itself with the options, the command line options it has. So it seems to work. And all the other bullets you can read yourself. It's how you run a pipeline and how you connect things to ports. Once you know what ports are, and we'll get to that. So let's have a look at pipelines. What actually is a pipeline? A pipeline is something with one or more documents as input that process the data. It flows through steps. These flowing can include merging, it can include splitting, and then it produces output or more multiple outputs. Inputs can be of any type, as the fish points out. It can be XML, HTML, JSON, text, or even binary documents. On one of the input ports, as I depicted here, it will probably be one document per input, but you can also push multiple documents through one input. So ports are the things that data flow in and out, and they're very important. Now, the nice thing about XProc is once you've defined a step, you can use it as a step of your own in a bigger pipeline, as I've depicted here. So the step that we've created here can be used in a much larger pipeline here. That's easy to do, although we won't cover that in this webinar. And that makes a step and a pipeline interchangeable concepts. A step and a pipeline is essentially the same. So you will probably hear me use the terms both a lot, but they mean the same thing in XProc. All right, so let's have a closer look at steps or pipelines, if you want to. What are important concepts of steps? And I will do that with an example of the p-add attribute step. This is a standard step in the standard step library. And as you will probably guess, it adds an attribute to an element. So what happens here? What are important things here? The first thing is that it has ports, and ports are the things the documents flow in and out through. And this thing has a port that's called source, and that's where the input document, which in this case must be XML, flows in. It also has a port called result, through which the document with the added attribute flows out. And to make it more complete, it also has options. Options are switches, are the like parameters for the port, in which you can say where to add the attribute, the match, what name it should have, and what value it should have. You can also look at it as some of these technical boxes on the walls with wires going in and out and switches on it. to set the functionality. Now, could we also have found this out by looking at the specification? Yes, we can. So let's do that quickly. If we go to the standard step library and we go to the add attribute step, then what you'll see here in this pink box is that it has an input port, is a port called source, which has XML and HTML input types. It has an output port called result, which spits out XML or HTML. It has an option named match, it has an option named attribute name, and it has an option named attribute value. So this is consistent with what I just told you on the sheet. And if you read the text, you can read what it actually does. So let's use this, this step, this p-add attribute step in an example. And what I've done to make it a little more interesting, I did not start with an XML document, I start with a text document also to show you that it is possible. So what I do, I take in a text document, I wrap it in an element to make it a very simple XML document. I add a timestamp attribute, and that is the result of our little pipeline. So let's have a look at it in real. And how does a XProc pipeline look like? Here it is. Right. What you see here is how an XProc pipeline looks. And the root element of an XProc pipeline is the declare step. So as I already told you, steps and pipelines are interchangeable terms. Everything must be in the XProc namespace, and you must also declare that it's a version 3.0 pipeline. The first thing you notice is that there are ports declared here. It says this pipeline has an input port, it's called source, and it has an output port, it's called result. And on the input port, you see an href attribute. This is just me being lazy because this sets a default input for this port. You can override it by specifying another input file on the command line, but this sets the default, so I don't have to specify an input file now. The input text file is very uninteresting. So what actually happens here, the first thing is I run the input through a step. It's called wrap sequence, which wraps an element around anything that flows in, and then I add an attribute. I do it on the root element. I name it timestamp, and as value, please notice, I set it to the current date time. And as you can see here, I can use an attribute value template, an XPath expression between curly braces, which is executed to get the actual value. And you can, of course, use, like you can do in XSLT, put in any XPath expression in there. So what happens if we run this? Keep your fingers crossed. And there it goes. And there it is already. If you say, what you can see, it's wrapped, it's the text wrapped in an element text, and it has a timestamp attribute on it, around it. And this little ampersand thingy here is just Windows that adds a carriage return. All right, so that is our very first pipeline. Now, but you might be wondering, Eric, you told us that there are ports and there are input ports and output ports, but the wrapper and the add attribute step do not show any port connections. They're just there. So what's happening here? Well, what's happening here is something called implicit connections, and that's very, very useful. So how does that work? You have, every step can have an input port which is primary and an output port which is primary. Just one port just one input port and just one output port. The names of these ports are usually source and results, and that's by convention, and I suggest you stick to that, but if you want to deviate, be my guest. So, and why are these ports important? Because if you have two steps with primary input ports and primary output ports, like this, what happens is that the primary output port automatically clicks to the step of the next step in the pipeline. So what you see happening here is that data flows very naturally from top to bottom through your pipeline without you having to do any explicit connection of ports. And that's nice because it makes your pipelines much shorter. And it does even more. Here's our little, the skeleton of our little pipeline that we had, that we saw a minute ago. And what happens because of the primary ports is this. First, if a step has one input port and one output port, they're automatically primary. If not, or you want to set them explicitly, then you have a primary attribute you can use there. If an input port is primary, then what flows in there automatically flows into the first step of your pipeline. From there, because both rep sequence and add attribute have a primary port, they implicitly connect so that your document flows to the next one. And from the last step in your pipeline, you have an implicit connection to the primary output port of your encompassing step. So actually this makes it easy to use, easy to write. But of course, there's more to it, because sometimes you can't do implicit connections. You have to do explicit connections. So to demonstrate that, let's have a look first at a step that has multiple ports. And if there are multiple ports, in this case multiple input ports, only one can be primary. So what are we going to do with the non-primary port? And the step I want to talk about is the insert step. The insert step inserts one piece of XML into the other. And if you want to see the details, you can see them as I showed you for p-add attribute in the specification. Now, of course, p-add attribute, p-insert has a source port through which a base document flows in. It also has an insertion port through which a document to insert flows in. And the result is a combined document. And as the fish is so nice to point out for us, the source port and the result port are primary, but the insertion port is not. So there is there's never an implicit connection for the insertion port. And of course, this thing has options as well. It has a match, where will we insert this thing, the insertion, and it has a position, again, detailing where to insert things, either as first child, last child, or before or after the element pointed out by the match expression. So let's use this insert step in a pipeline. And it looks like this. We again start by wrapping a text document in a text element. Then we wrap this text element again in a doc element. We insert a title, and in this case, the title is fixed inside our pipeline. And we add a root timestamp attribute again, and that's our result document, which you see in the gray box, it should look a bit like that. So let's have a look at how that looks in real. It's example 2a. We're going to show variations. That's why there is a 2b and a 2c. Here are ports again. Here's our wrap sequence, and then we say we wrap it again. You might wonder what's the difference between wrap sequence and p-wrap. P-wrap is for wrapping XML elements in general. I could have used rep sequence here because rep sequence wraps an element out around the outside of a document, but I thought I would also point out that there is also a prep which is much more flexible and much more suitable to wrapping elements in an XML document. Then we have the insert step. We match on the root element and we say, okay, please insert something as first child. Position is first child. It has an input port called insertion, and we want to connect something to it. So you do that with a p with input element with the port name on it. In this case, of course, port is insertion. And what I say here, all right, I have an inline document, and inline means it's stated in my XProc pipeline, and it just says here, hi there. And after I've done that, I add an attribute timestamp to with the current date time. So let's run that. And as you can see it's there. It has a doc element with a timestamp. It has a title element, and it has the text element in there. It's not nicely formatted, but we're going to do something about it very soon. So we have what we've done here is we've stated the inline document inside the p inline, and that's the, how shall I say it, official way of doing it. However, we added, as the XProc 3 added some syntactic sugar, and you can also write it like this without a p inline. You can only do that if it's a single XML document, but if that's the case, and it will usually be, then this saves you some typing. So you can leave out the p inline element within the p with input. I'm not going to run this because it will do exactly the same as the 2a example. But as we have seen in the output, our output is not indented. It's a long string of XML. What if I wanted to nicely indent my output? Well, you can do that. And to do that, you have to say to the output port, please do some different ways when you serialize it. Serializing is writing an XML document back to disk. And in XProc 3, you do that by providing it with a map. You set a serialization attribute here, and you say, okay, and you give it a map value. So you write it like you write a map in XPath. And in this case, you say, please set indent to true. Now, there are lots of other ways and things you can do to affect the serialization, and you can all find them in the specification. And there's like things like meta, do you want it like XML or HTML, whether you want an XML declaration at the top, etc., etc. You can all change that by changing the map you pass into the serialization. But does this work? Well, let's try. There we go. And as you can see, the output is now nicely indented. All right, let's go on. What we now did, the title we inserted came from the XProc pipeline itself, but that's of course not a very realistic situation. What if we wanted to read it from an external file? And this file is already XML. So what we're doing, we actually do the same, but we read the title from an external file. How does that look? Here we have it. Again, everything is the same, except that we now link our insertion port to a document by providing it with a p document element and an href attribute that says to what file it should read. And actually the result will be exactly the same, or just say, let's hope that. And as you can see, no surprise, the result is the same. But in this case, it read the title element from an external file. There's also a syntactic sugar variation here, which makes you having less to type, which is this one. Instead of saying a P document, you can also put the href attribute on the P with input element itself. Now you might wonder why ever is there still a P document element? Well, there are cases in which you need it because for very special inputs where you want to set parameters or other special things. But in most cases, you can do it as you can see it here. And I won't run this because the result will be exactly the same as the previous one. So this is how you connect an external XML file to the insertion port of the insert step. But let's make it a little bit more interesting. Let's get back to the presentation first. What if we have our title text in a text document? So then we have to wrap it in a title element first before we insert the title element. How does that work? Then we get, then here it gets really interesting. Let's have a look at the pipeline, and now it's getting a little bit more complicated. Ooh, it's longer. So let's have a look at what's happening here. The first thing is that we say, okay, we have a wrap sequence step. We've seen that one already, but when we've used it there, we used the implicit connection of its source port. What we're now going to do is we override the implicit connection of its source port. We say pay with input port is through, port is source, sorry. And we load a document from this called href title.text. So what happens here, it loads, the input port gets this text document and wraps a title around it. What you might also notice that we gave it a name, and we called it, and that I gave the name, and I call it load title. Okay, so here we have our title wrapped in a text element. So let's do the rest. We always started with wrapping what came in on the input port, because there was a text document on the input port of our main pipeline with a text element here. We can no longer rely on the implicit connection because it's no longer the first step in our pipeline. This is the first step in our pipeline. This was the first step in our pipeline, and we could use implicit connection, but we cannot do that any longer. So we have to tell this wrap sequence that please read it from the source port of example pipeline. An example pipeline is the name I gave to my main pipeline here. So this says, please read it from the input port of my main pipeline. And then it flows in here. And after that, our implicit connections kick in again. So this flows into the wrap, this flows into the insert port. But where does the insert port, where does the insertion come from? The insertion comes from here. So here we wrapped our title element and we want to put it in here. So we gave it a name. So we say here, please connect it to the result port of the step I named load title, which is here. And then we add an attribute, again, called timestamp, which is again an implicit connection. So what I showed you here is that by giving steps a name, you can explicitly connect to the ports these steps have. So let's have a look whether that works. And I don't think you will be very surprised that it will. And here you are. It's just, the output is exactly the same as the last time, except that now a lot of different things are happening. There is also syntactic sugar for this P pipe here. which is nice because you can shorten it to this. You can shorten it to a pipe attribute on the pwif input port. In this case, you say port name at step name. And here also port name at step name. So you can connect them either by using a pipe or a pipe attribute. Now let's make this one a little bit more complex, because what we now do, we load a fixed document called title.txt from a fixed file on disk. But what if I wanted to make my title document, my title text document, another input port? So I would like to add a new input port to my pipeline through which the title text flows in. What happens then? How does that look? It looks like this. Let's go through the changes. The first thing that you might notice that the p input port now has a primary is true attribute, which it should have, because we now have two input ports and the XProc processor does no longer know which one of them is primary. If you wouldn't have used this attribute, none of the input ports would have been primary, but we still would like the input port to be the source port to be primary, so we have to explicitly set the primary is true there. And we've declared an input port. I called it title doc, and because I'm lazy, I gave it a default file to load, which you can override on the command line if you want. So this means that our new this means that our first step now reads from title doc, the port title doc at example pipeline. So it gets its input from there. I can run it for you, but I'll assure you the output of this little pipeline is exactly the same as we've already seen a dozen times. So, so this is how you can explicitly connect to ports in your pipeline, either through pipe or through a pipe attribute. All right. Now, one of the things I've told you is that steps can have options. Pipelines can have options. They can have little switches with which you can change the functionality of your pipeline. Now, what if we wanted to add a pipeline, add an option to our pipeline ourselves? What I did here, I added an author option, and I wrap this in an author element and insert it as an author element inside my result document, as you can see in the gray box there. So how can we do that? How does that look? Sorry, here. Let's have a look at example 5. It's only one. Now this is exactly the same as we've seen before, but it has an option author. And and also here, because I'm lazy, I gave it a default value, Eric. How can we use such an option? Well, in very many ways. And this is just a teaser, because we're going to talk about options more next Monday. But let's assume we want to add this author as an author element to our result. There's more than one way to do it, but this is how I did it. Before adding the last attribute, I insert it and I use this author option to create actually a very small XML document where the author element is expanded. And as you can see here, you cannot also use value templates, these things between curly braces, for attributes, but you can also use them for text elements in your XML documents. They work like XQuery does. If there's something in it, it will expand there. So here we create a very little document with an author root element, and we insert it into the document we already created before. Now, let's just for the fun run this. So, and as you can see, the author element is actually inserted there. All right. That was it for our first one-on-one session. Let's just wrap it up very quickly. XProc is a pipeline language for documents. It chains steps together. Documents flow in and out of steps through ports, which are very important, which you should be aware of. One input port and one output port can be primary, and these ports automatically connect, and they are called source and result by convention. And you can connect a port explicitly to either another port, that will be done implicitly if you don't do anything, or explicitly by giving it a pipe or a pipe element or a pipe attribute, to a document in line or a document on disk. And we have options which you can use as parameters to your pipelines to change their functionality. So that was it. Here are the links again. I hope you've enjoyed it. I will now stop sharing my screen and give control back to the organization.
Thank you, Eric. So, how to put questions best? Just one moment. Applause, says Christophe Machan. And I agree. Thank you very much. Let me see, there are no other questions there, so I will ask from the chat. So could you say a little something about implicit connections that Dave Pawson think is a bit confusing? Hang on, maybe I could. Dave, do you want to ask yourself? That might be easier.
Dave, you now have the stage.
You have the stage, yeah.
Nothing.
Oopsie. I clicked several Daves there.
Am I available, please?
You are. Thank you.
Oh, good. With an XSLT background, I find the steps and elements within steps hard to comprehend without a context. Does that make sense as a question? I'm not even sure I know enough to ask sensible questions.
Well, obviously you have to get used to the syntax of XProc before you can fully understand it. There's nothing I can do about that.
And I can't get used to the syntax without understanding context.
Yes, but I'm not sure how I can explain it any more clear to you than I did.
Okay.
If you want to read it, I wrote an introductory article on xml.com. It's on xml.com. Maybe it makes more, maybe reading it helps you in understanding it.
Maybe.
Maybe. Sorry, I can't be any more of help here.
So Eric, another question from Dave actually. So why is output using a map not XML to add properties? I sort of like that question.
Yeah, well, maps are quite ubiquitous in XProc. We use maps all over the place to set things, especially when you have multiple properties you can set, as is obviously the case for serialization. it's not only there, it also makes things like merging serialization options easier. Just an example, if you do an XSLT transformation, which the step for this I haven't shown you, but in your XSLT you can set your serialization options with an XSL output element. This will end up in a map that flows with the document and will be merged with the map that is set in the serialization option of the P output element. Using maps makes this kind of merging of properties much easier.
So is it using maps as dictionaries with a name and a value? Is that the reason you're using maps?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Also, when you, for instance, want to pass parameters to an XSLT style sheet for the XSL param elements, the global XSL param elements, you have to specify them as a map to the XSLT step.
Which is an XSLT 3.0 attribute. Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's an XPath 3.1.
Okay.
Yeah,
XPath 3.0.
Yeah.
There's also several questions actually about debugging this sort of thing. So let's see, really tiny text. It would be good to see in a debugger to see the steps. And there's also another one about running this sort of thing in Oxygen. So what can you tell us about debugging?
Debugging, well.
XProc 3.
Debugging XProc 3. Well, there, if you expect a debugger, I have to disappoint you. There's no debugger yet. And I don't think anybody is building it. But there are some tricks you can use to debug XProc style sheets. One is that you can put a message attribute on any step, and this message attribute will then, well, obviously throw this message on the standard out when it executes. So you can just then follow what your pipeline does. That's one thing. Another thing that you usually do when you debug a pipeline is store intermediate results. For instance, most of my pipelines are chained XSLTs. But I want to see what goes out from one XSLT and into the next. XProc has a pstore step, which actually stores what is flowing through it to a file on disk. So you can use it to store the intermediate result to a whatever temporary directory or whatever. So you can refer to it as you can look at it later to see what your steps did. The pstore step itself just takes pushes out the document that flows in back to its output port. So it does nothing. Well, it stores, but it does nothing in the pipeline itself except storing the document. So I think these are the two most important tricks for debugging, actually. But they're tricks, I admit.
So what about Oxygen support, Eric?
Well, I hope that someone from Oxygen is listening in, but Oxygen supports XProc 1 out of the box using the XML Calabash processor, and I think there's a plugin for the Morgana XProc 1 processor. It does not yet support XProc 3, unfortunately. But if we all send mails to George, then maybe the next version will.
Thank you. Let's see, we are sort of running out of time now.
Yeah.
But to all of you, the webinar month of June, we'll end that with an XProc Q&A session. So there will be time to ask questions. And as you probably realize, we're sort of learning this webinar thing as we go along. It's our very first time, so I do apologize if there's been a couple of kinks and bugs from our side. But I want to thank Eric for an excellent presentation, and I do hope that you will all be back on Monday. same time, registration through our website, MarkupUK.org. So thank you very much, Eric.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
See you all again soon.
Let's hope so. Bye.
Bye.